Vince came in and he said, what if there's a guy named Saul Good? Like Saul Good. And then another writer said, it's Saul Goodman. And so it was Saul Goodman. It's almost as soon as Saul Goodman was introduced in season 2 of Breaking Bad, we started joking around about wouldn't it be funny to do a Saul Goodman spinoff. The first thing we pitched to AMC and Sony was actually a half-hour single camera in the vein of a combination, I'd say, of MASH and Dr. Katz. What that spoke to, I think, was our lack of understanding of the character. And once we started thinking about it more deeply, we realized if the only way you can have an interesting show is to introduce a series of problematic characters for your guy to solve, maybe that character is not interesting enough to support a TV show. The single biggest challenge for us starting Better Call Saul was that Saul Goodman on Breaking Bad seemed happy with himself. He seemed happy with his life. As we started thinking about it, we realized that how is that dramatic? What's the burr in his saddle? What's he trying to solve in his life? And so the question was, what kind of problem does becoming Saul Goodman solve?
People talk about liking a character, and I think, yes, likability is there. That is a real thing. But ultimately, I think what really engages us is desire. Yeah. You're really a character who doesn't want anything is inherently kind of static. And this guy, we had to kind of dig into this guy a little bit to find that well of imperfection and desire and desperation and sweat that kind of makes for a real dramatic character.
One of our biggest concerns was, how do we let the audience know that Jimmy McGill is not Saul Goodman, that this is a guy who is starting off trying to be a good guy. He's trying to do things the right way. He's trying to be more or less a decent person. And so really the first 2 episodes, we were thinking especially about Breaking Bad fans. How are they going to understand this guy's not, anytime he meets someone, he doesn't have some secret agenda trying to take them for a ride, which I think if you watched Saul Goodman, you might think that's who this guy is. And that's who we thought he was at first. If this is about a guy, about Jim McGill's moral descent, he's going to get more and more successful in some ways being bad. I mean, it's axiomatic. He's going to become successful by doing things that he shouldn't. One thing that keep in mind is that we look at the morality of what the characters are doing, and I think the audience does too. It's something that people, I don't think, always take very seriously. And we wanted to put that all in the context of the fact that this is all going to add up to nothing. He's not going to end up where he wants to be.
Well, this is a method of writing the story out on 3x5 cards very carefully that Vince brought to Breaking Bad from X-Files. Mm-hmm. And Tom also worked on X-Files. And there's so we have a whole method of writing these cards. It's very low tech.
They'll talk things through, and then they'll write out on index cards whenever they feel like they've got something like a scene described really solidly and everybody feels good about it. And they usually know a lot of the dialogue. A lot of it will change when the writer actually gets in. But they know what's happening in the scene and what all the beats are. They'll write those beats out on index cards, pin them up on the board, and they'll do that for every scene of the episode. And then when that's done, we'll make a copy of all of those cards and give it to the writer of the episode, and they'll start working on their outline. And then when they finish the outline, they'll go on to the script.
One of the tricks to the writer's room is to take any idea that comes up and try to pursue it, try to chase it down and see where it goes. Because sometimes something that can sound really unpromising or not interesting to you, if you keep thinking about it and take it from every angle and say, well, what does this other character think of this? As long as you're moving things forward, you're helping.
I would say that the best advice I would ever have is don't just pitch problems, pitch solutions. Like if you notice something that's where you say, this doesn't quite work for me in something that's being pitched. If you just say, I don't like that, it stops things. It's right. Sort of like an improv. You just said no to somebody rather than saying, hey, could we do something like this? Here's my problem. let me elucidate it as much as I can, and let me say, is there a way that we could shift what we're doing to incorporate that, rather than just saying.
And also the other thing is, you have to keep in mind, it's play. You're watching the show in your mind. It may look like you're sitting around a table with a bunch of other people, but it's like you're watching this branching version of the show and all the different places it could go. And if your attitude is right, that's kind of fun. It's enjoyable. If there's a trick to this, in my opinion, it's to listen to the characters and don't try to force them into a scene or a situation that you think you want to have. If we're honest with ourselves about who these people are, oftentimes they surprise us.
Truth is that it's not so much us trying to surprise the audience as the characters surprising us. And when we find that we're having trouble writing an episode, it's usually because we don't truly understand who this character is at this moment. Because the other thing about him, and this probably is the thing that's most similar to Breaking Bad, to my mind anyway, is that this guy's always changing.
Yeah, I mean, with Breaking Bad and with Saul, it's really writing ourselves into corners, busting our heads up against the wall, trying to figure out how do we get these characters out of it. Because if it's not easy to figure out how to get your characters out of certain situations, then it will be surprising to the audience, because you have to put in a lot of work. And as long as it all is logical and makes sense, that surprise all that hard work will hopefully carry over to the audience where like, oh, I did not see that coming. And that's really part of the thrill.
And so that's kind of an interesting thing for all the writers who are listening. I think a lot of times you try to not have problems, right? The goal is let's come up with a story and follow it through, and let's not have a problem. Let's try to proceed where we just know everything. These guys, they love being stuck. Like, just how do you get there? And then the writing and the work is in just sweating, trying to justify and find your way in a way that feels organic. And they're great at that.
Prior to this, joining the Breaking Bad universe, I don't think I really let the characters take me away. I would set, this is where I want to get to, and by hook or by crook, I'm going to make my characters go there. And just letting that go really brought me an enormous amount of freedom.
The character's behavior has to make sense to us moment by moment. That doesn't mean that there can't be mysteries about why people do what they do, but if there's a mystery, we've at least talked about what's actually going on with the person. And the problem with thinking too far ahead is that you can try to force your character down a predetermined path. There is a trick, and the trick is not to always look forward to what happens next, but to look back and to take apart what you've already done and try to say, well, what did that mean? The beginning of Better Call Saul, we see that there's this guy who we've met later in life as the right-hand man to a drug kingpin, a cold-blooded murderer is what Mike becomes. But when we meet him on Better Call Saul, he's the grouchy guy manning a booth, and you put those things in, and I know that means something, but then the discipline is trying to understand what that means, or to maybe even pick up a detail that was put into the show just to make the world feel more full, and then take that as gospel and say, well, what does that mean? How would you project that into the future? Why did that character really do that at that moment? One of our mainstays in the Better Call Saul writer's room is Ariel Levine, who was our writer's assistant, and she makes it a practice to watch all of Breaking Bad every year before we open the room.
All of it.
And so she always has it at her fingertips. And there's a lot of other people in the room and associated with the show who keep their finger on the pulse. There's something called a story calendar that we keep, which tells you, at least in theory, what day everything happened on every episode.
Well, we've been putting together an encyclopedia of sorts to make sure that we know what's canon. And Joey and Heather and Ariel over here have been collecting all of the facts about when people were where, or what we said about people and who their family lines are and stuff like that in Breaking Bad. So whenever any character comes up that might have existed in the Breaking Bad universe, there's always sort of a quick litmus test where Vince and Peter, the writers, will be like, hey, does it make sense for so-and-so to have been in Albuquerque at this time? Or like, just so-and-so, no so-and-so. And we'll be able to give them sort of a gut reaction.
We want to know as much as we can of the real way that something works, and then give it just the shades, like you say, just the pieces that we can put on screen, which is a thing we did with, meth making in Breaking Bad, and with the law, with specific legal practice here. Just know it in detail and then put out as little as we possibly can. So we're not giving blueprints of how to launder money or whatever, but it still feels like you know how to launder money once you watch an episode. And one thing that I think I've really learned and taken to heart is, like, no matter how good your dialogue is, use less. Boil it down. There's less, you need less than you think. And if you ever have a choice between a line of clever dialogue or a slug line that will help somebody reading the script understand what's going on inside of the character, cut the dialogue. If you ever read one of our scripts, they're aired out so that when somebody reads them, you get a sense of the turns of the scene. We try and give people at least what we understand. At least we've thought about it, so we can give you a leg up and see, like, okay, this is what we think is happening between these two lines. This is what we think is happening inside the character, so that there's a baseline to start from. And that's been incredibly technically useful, to be freed up to be like, hey, this is the journey. This is what's important, is what's going on inside the people, not just how clever they are when they're speaking, or what the razzmatazz of the scene as it's moving through space is, but like the interiority.
I've never written so much description, because there are lots of details that you want to communicate to the different departments. Whether it's your costume designer, your production designer, your cinematographer, whatever. And so I had never worked that way before. And I don't know, it's and again, with the dialogue, it's definitely less is more. So, and now I can't imagine doing it any other way.
A lot of the complaints about stories are moral complaints. The characters aren't getting what they deserve. If you think about shows that people have had a big problem with, sometimes it feels like the moral structure of the show somehow changed and people got an undeserved happy ending or something. Looking at life, you see that people get all kinds of things that they don't necessarily deserve. But that tells me is that there's a desire. We love, in shapely fiction, we like to think that the bad guys lose and the good guys win, but which is great, and I'm all for it. Although there's all kinds of winning and there's all kinds of losing, and there's all kinds of bad guys and there's all kinds of good guys. But I think that's a lot of what we think about is what does this character deserve? What haven't we seen before? What would be a just what is the just desserts for this person, and do they get it or do they not get it, and how? I think we all have kind of a sense of a moral structure for the world. We don't always agree on what it is, but I think that's a lot. It's funny how much of fiction is really about that. Maybe this is how the world works. Maybe this is how the world should work, and what makes an ending feel good.
When we originally started talking about the show, we said, well, and it ends the moment when Walter White walks in and says, Walter White walks into his office. That's the end of the show. And maybe that's not the end of the show.
Whether it's a screenplay club you form and everyone reads their stuff once a week, or you write a few jokes and do them in stand-up, or you turn the opening of your film into a short film and you shoot 2 short films every year, you gotta be putting it up and getting those seeing how those reactions are going, because that is part of you can't go sit in a corner. Whenever I talk to people and they're like, I've written 3 screenplays and no one's ever read them, and well, I don't know, if you're any good. You don't know if you're any good. You gotta interact. It's the novelists and poets go off in a corner, and what we do is an interaction all the time.